Hello everybody and welcome back to Schedule School. Today is seminar 3 and we are going to be looking at aids and equipment. For those of you who don't know, Schedule School is a free resource, although on the website there is an option to donate to the Spinal Injuries Association if you feel that you have found this resource useful and you wish to donate. It is hosted by junior practitioners and we are guided by senior practitioners at taking schedules in bite-sized chunks at one head of loss at a time. If you haven't already, please do visit our website, www.scheduleschool.co.uk, and catch up with seminar 1 and 2, where we go back to basics and also look at care and case management. Also on the website is our fictional case study, which we use throughout. But in summary, in each seminar, we will use the fictional claimant Penny Foster. Penny Foster was involved in a road traffic accident where she sustained, amongst other injuries, a spinal cord fracture, a spinal cord injury, which rendered her paraplegic. She is now a wheelchair user. Her previous accommodation is unsuitable, and she has lifelong care, aids and equipment and therapy needs. Before we start today, please let me apologise for the slight delay between this one and seminar 2. Unfortunately, practice got in the way a little bit, but we were also waiting the MENCAP decision, which I will come back to in a moment. But before we get on to that, let me introduce who I am joined by today. For those of you who don't know me, I am Lois Norris. I'm a personal injury and clinical negligence barrister at number 5 Chambers. And my co-host today is Demi Newlove, who is a personal injury practitioner at Stuart's. I'm also joined by my pupil supervisor today, Gemma Roberts, and she is going to be guiding us through all of the maths and taking us through the Ogden tables. Gemma Roberts practices in personal injury, clinical negligence and employment, and has a specialist interest in serious injury cases. Gemma represented some of the claimants in the Dr. Patterson breast surgeon case, and her most recent notable case was acting for the successful respondent in the Court of Appeal and the Employment Appeal Tribunal in the case of Addons versus the University Hospitals Birmingham NHS Foundation Trust. Gemma, before we start today, can you just give us a quick recap on the MENCAP decision and the implications it could have had?
Yeah, certainly. The key issue that the Supreme Court had to decide was whether or not national minimum wage applies to what are being called sleep-in workers. The two particular care workers involved in the case each had jobs which involved them being able to sleep whilst they were at work. And in particular, the lead claimant, Mrs. Tomlinson Blake, she was able to sleep at work, but had to keep out a listening ear, as it were, in case she were needed, because she was providing care to 2 vulnerable adults at their own home. So when she worked at night, she was permitted to sleep, but had to remain at that place of work. She had no duties to perform except to keep that listening ear out whilst asleep and to attend to emergencies, which in her case were infrequent. And while she was there at work and asleep, she wasn't paid the national minimum wage. And the question for the Supreme Court was whether carers in her position should be paid the national minimum wage for each hour that they are sleeping in on shift. And from that summary, it'll be immediately apparent that the decision was going to have important ramifications for care providers and claimants in serious injury cases where they have these sleep-in carers, because it could have resulted in a significant increase in the cost of nighttime care. The other appellant in that case was Mr. Shannon. He worked in a residential care home. He was provided free accommodation at the care home, was paid a fixed amount per week, but was required to be present from 10 p.m. till 7 a.m. And again, he was permitted to sleep during that period, but he had to assist if a night care worker on duty needed his assistance. And again, in his case, in practice, it was rarely called upon. And the Supreme Court gave a judgment which disappointed many of those involved in the care sector, but I think was of some relief to those who have drafted significant claims and have got Part 36 offers on the table, and that in essence the status quo is being maintained. The Supreme Court decided that it's a complicated judgment as to the application of the national minimum wage, and with my PI Clinneg hat on rather than my employment law hat on, I won't go into the details of it. But in essence, the Low Pay Commission recommended that the sleep-in workers in this scenario don't apply or don't qualify for the national minimum wage, and the Supreme Court in essence stood behind that. And so it was the appeal was dismissed. The effect is that sleep-in provision cannot be described as performing work within the meaning of the regulations. So it's a technical answer by the Supreme Court that in essence the regulations don't define that type of sleep-in working as work. The broader question that will arise is whether or not the legislation therefore needs to be changed so that that sleep-in worker is defined as performing work. And of course, if that happens, then I think there will be a change, and the national minimum wage will then have to apply to sleep-in carers, which will increase the care costs that we will have to impose in our schedules in this sort of scenario.
That's helpful, thank you.
Yep, so today we're going to be talking about aids and equipment, as Lewis has said, in the context of catastrophic injury cases. We must say this topic is wide-ranging and encompasses a range of things from kitchen utensils, hoists and assistive technology. So we're going back to the basics and looking at need, appropriateness, cost and replacement intervals, all of the time, keeping in mind that the aim is to place the claimant as much as possible in the position they had been in if the tort had not occurred. So we will do a few worked examples, and we are assisted on the website by an extract of an ERT report for Penny Foster, which will give us some figures. Special thanks to Fiona Johnson Limited for that, who are a medical legal company who specialise in catastrophic injury claims. They've really helped us there with wheelchair and equipment knowledge. So we will look briefly at emerging technology by having a brief discussion about exoskeletons. Gemma, to kick us off, do you want to take us through how the courts will approach aids and equipment generally?
Yeah, this follows on quite nicely from the second seminar where there was a talk about what's the court's approach to care, and the approach to aids and equipment is very similar. There's something called the Realist Principle, and what that says, and you talked about it at the last seminar, is that care is allowable if it's reasonably required objectively by the claimant. And so the same applies with aids. And there's an important case, A against Powys Local Health Board, where Mr. Justice Lloyd Jones confirmed that this principle, that it's where a claimant has chosen a reasonable package of care, or in this case equipment, then the court ought to allow it. That is what's reasonable. It's no argument for the defendant to come along and say, well, here's an alternative reasonable package, which is cheaper. The claimant should get on with that. So it really emphasizes the 100% compensation principle. If the claimant chooses a package of care or of equipment which is objectively reasonable, then that is what the court should allow. And that very much drives then the court's approach to how it assesses what equipment and aids are needed. So the fundamental question is it reasonable? And the court is very often guided by the medical expert evidence. So in substantial injury cases, there'll often be a care report and an OT report. Sometimes you get the same expert giving both care and OT advice, and they will explain, having assessed the claimant in their home environment, what particular equipment is going to be reasonably necessary to assist them in their day-to-day activities, to make them as independent as possible, as you say, Demi, to put them back in the position that they would have been in, but for the tort that they suffered. So the key is it necessary? Is it reasonably necessary? Will the claimant actually use the equipment? It's all very well having an expert saying, well, this person needs X, Y, and Z types of computer. If in reality, it's a technophobe who isn't going to use it, who isn't going to be benefited from it, then the court will say, well, look, that's not going to be reasonably necessary. But broadly speaking, if the claimant can show it will assist them, that it is objectively reasonable for them to have it, the court will allow it. The other things that the court will look at are the sort of the practicalities of the equipment that's going to be needed. So how often will the equipment be used? How quickly will it wear out? Will somebody only use a wheelchair from time to time, and therefore the wheelchair has a longer than expected lifespan? Will the equipment be used very heavily? Therefore, you need to have frequent replacements built into your schedule. So there's lots of detail that you and your expert really need to think carefully about, with the claimant in the center of it. What are the particular needs? How will the equipment be used? And then how do you translate that into your schedule and the evidence to the court so that you can get the costs of it?
So the schedule, in whichever format you choose, is going to have to cover past and future losses for aids and equipment. And as we will see, these may change over time. So let's start with past losses. As we saw in seminar 1 and 2, past losses encompasses any losses from the date of the accident until the date of the calculation. So in Penny's case, we know that that is the 1st of September 2021. So let us look at past losses, Gemma. We have dealt with the approach to aids and equipment generally, but what if the defendant says, you bought this and you shouldn't have, it's not required, or it's too expensive?
Yeah, so the test that the court applies is, was it reasonable at the time of the purchase? So hindsight is a wonderful thing, but it has no application in looking at a reasonable cost, reasonable damages schedule. If a claimant is advised by their treating clinician that they will be assisted if they use a particular type of knee brace, let's say, they buy the knee brace, but it turns out they don't get on with it, that's a waste, you would say, of £500. Because it was objectively reasonable for them to purchase it at the time, because the expert or whoever, the physiotherapist, said it's likely to assist, that would be a recoverable cost. And so putting that into a schedule is really quite straightforward. All you need to do is find out the cost that was paid, when it was paid, make sure you've got evidence to support it, so keep the receipts and that sort of thing. And then we put it into the schedule in the way that we've got on the slide here. So you work out the date of purchase, you find your capital cost, and the only adjustments or maths that we need to do concerns the rate of interest. Now, there's lots of great websites online that have little interest calculators in them that you can sort of cheat and use. But if you want to do it properly, then what you have to do is work out the period of loss. So if we have, for example, a purchase on the 1st of September 2019, the rate of interest at that time was 0.5%. You've got to note that the rate of interest changed on the 1st of June 2020 to 0.1%. So there's two bits to the calculation. But we look then at the first period, so from the date of purchase on the 1st of September 2019 to when the interest rate changed on the 31st of May 2019, that's a period of 274 days. So all you have to do, you do 1,200 divided by 100, which gives us 12. So that's it as a percentage. The percentage that we need is 0.5%. So we multiply our 12 by 0.5, that gives us 6. And then to find the daily rates, we divide that figure by 365. You get an awful lot of decimal places, and then we multiply by the number of days that we've got. And so for this particular case, you get £4.50. Now that's a lot of maths. I'll just go through it again with the second period that we're looking at here. That's where the interest rate was at 0.1%. So from the 1st of June 2020 to the date of our calculation, that's a period of 457 days. So to get the interest rate, we have to turn it into a percentage. So our capital sum, 1,200 over 100, times by our appropriate rate, 0.1%, and then times that, that's the, if you like, the daily interest rate, we times that by our number of days, which is 457. And it just so turns out that we get a nice round number here of £6.
Perfect, thank you. Gemma, we've looked at a manual wheelchair there briefly. Can we also just have a look at doing the same calculation, just so everyone can get used to it, also at the commode if possible?
Yeah, so again, this is a sort of standard thing that somebody might buy for themselves as soon as they get out of hospital or out of a rehab centre. They're going to buy basic equipment. It won't last them forever, and it's not going to be most suitable for their needs, but all of it is going to be recoverable if they're reasonable to purchase it. So in Penny's case, she buys a commode toilet with a capital cost of £215. So we go through that same calculation. We look at the two different periods where there's a different interest rate. So from the date of purchase on the 1st of December 2019, all the way through to the 31st of May 2020, the interest rate was at 0.5%. So it's a relatively straightforward calculation. 215 over 100 times by 0.5 to get our annual interest figure. Then we divide that by 365, multiply by the number of days that we're using, which in this case, I think again is on the screen. And then we do the same for the second period, and you'll see the overall total is 81p here. The way you set out the schedule, it's to some extent personal preference, whether you put each item of loss and then your interest calculation underneath it. That's how I tend to work, and that's, I think, what the majority of people do. It is acceptable also to go through each of your individual losses. So you'd have your wheelchair, your commode, and so forth, and then you can have all of your interest calculations at the bottom. I find that slightly harder to do because if you're changing some of your figures, you've got to remember to go to the bottom to change the interest. And so I tend to put it all together like that.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And when Gemma was just going through that, then you'll notice that one of the things that we pointed out is that when Penny came out of hospital, or any claimant, they may have just bought some items. But when we are thinking of items, for example, a wheelchair, if we were doing it without expert evidence, it might be quite simple to say, well, Penny needs a wheelchair and that's that. But as we'll see, it isn't just the wheelchair that will be costed for. It's also all the add-ons that will be needed that would not have been needed had Penny not been injured in the accident. So those include tyres, batteries. You'll often have, as you'll see in Gemma's worked examples coming up, annual costs for insurance and maintenance. You may also need hoists and slings if required. And then again, there's also some things you may not think of, such as rain covers and wheelchair gloves. So it's important to keep all of those included as well. And when we're talking about wheelchairs, today we are simplifying it purposely because we're going back to basics and we're showing you how you would work out aids and equipment in schedules. But it's important to remember that in these cases, it's likely that there's not just going to be one type of wheelchair. There's manual wheelchairs, there's wheelchairs with power add-ons, there's all-terrain wheelchairs, and which wheelchair a claimant requires will really depend, as Gemma said earlier, on what the claimant requires and putting the claimant at the focal point and looking at how they will actually use this equipment. So we are simplifying this somewhat, and you will notice that in the extract of the OT report we use for Penny, we've only taken a few items. We've not said where they'll come from, and we really are taking this back to basics. So that's just something to bear in mind as we go through this. It's now time to look at future losses, and this is the time where things are going to get very Ogden based. You should have the Ogden tables. It's helpful to have pen and paper because the best way to use this resource is to work through it as we do it. And you should also have, if you can, facts and figures. That does include some tables that we will be using that the Ogden tables don't have. As as always, slight disclaimer that the maths that Gemma is going to do now by no means constitutes any legal advice or guidance as to how every schedule should be done. Each schedule is different practitioners will approach them differently. So this is just a guide for junior practitioners. But Gemma, using the extract of the care report that we can see here, can you take us through the future life of this wheelchair and how we will calculate it? And I think one of the things you're going to touch on here, we're looking on the screen now at the capital cost of a wheelchair, which needs to be replaced every 5 years. And in this extract of the care report, the OT report, the expert has taken the capital sum and simply divided it by 5. And I think you're going to pick up here on something that Dan picked up on in seminar 1 as to how you should approach it when you're doing your schedule.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Lois. The temptation when you see a care report, which says something to the effect of particular type of equipment is going to be needed until a certain age, and the care expert is very likely to have annualized the cost for you. It's very tempting just to say, right, how many years from now till age 63, times that by the annual cost that the expert has given you, and off you go. That would be fine if you're doing a rough and ready calculation to look at some sort of broad overall valuation of a case for the purposes of coming up with a Part 36 or something like that. But the correct approach to do it is to find out the cost of a payment once every 5 years. And that involves, as you say, our friends, the Ogden tables, and it's a multiplicand approach. One thing, Lois, I think before we go through this, it might be useful just to comment on what a defendant might say. And a defendant might say, well, for example, Penny came out of hospital in an NHS wheelchair. Therefore, we don't think she's going to purchase her own wheelchair. She can stick with in the future with an NHS wheelchair. The burden actually is on a defendant to demonstrate that somebody isn't going to use private healthcare or buy their own equipment, and it's quite difficult for defendants to do that. So it's unlikely that they would succeed in somewhere like this. But that's the general argument that a defendant might raise, is to say, well, she's not going to be buying her own wheelchairs in future, therefore this is all pointless. Most defendants, I think, would realise that that's going to be a difficult argument. So look, coming back to where we are, we've got a capital cost, £2,615. So what we have to do, well, we're going back to the first seminar where we looked at the life expectancy of Penny. So we've got a life expectancy report which sets a specific date for her life expectancy, which is to age 75 years, and that's 36.72 years in the future. But we're not dealing with the full life period here. We're only looking to start with for the period until Penny is age 63, because our care expert has told us in her report that Penny will need this particular type of wheelchair till the age of 63, and at that time her needs are going to change. So in our schedule, we deal first of all with what we call wheelchair 1. So the capital cost is 2,615, and we're going to use table A5, which is at page 39 of the current set of facts and figures, because it makes our calculations a lot more straightforward than going through using table 35 for everything, although you can do that if you're particularly geeky and really love your calculator. So all we have to do is take our table A5, and we know that our period of loss, if you like, that we're looking at is 25 years. That's age 63. From where we are now, it's 24.72, but for the sake of argument, we call it 25 years. So we look down the N column on page 39, table A5, till we reach 25. We also know that the capital costs are going to be incurred at 5-year intervals. So we can read across the top row, frequency of payment in years, till we find the number 5. And then it's simply a question of going down the column for 5 until we reach the row for 25. And we see that the appropriate factor is 5.19. In other words, that's what we have to multiply our capital sum by in order to work out what the costs are going to be for each of these payments at the 5-year intervals. It's really important that you don't make Penny wait 5 years until she gets her first wheelchair. So you've got to add on 1 to that, because that represents the initial purchase that's going to happen, if you like, on day 0. So our multiplier is 6.19 times the capital sum 2615, and we get the sum of £16,186.85. Reasonably straightforward. We also need to remember that there's going to be annual maintenance costs, annual insurance costs, which your care expert should set out for you in the report. In this case, the annual maintenance and insurance costs are £199. For that, we can just look at a continuous loss for 25 years. So again, we can simply take our table A5, and there's a continuous loss column, which is the second one down, and that gives us the multiplier figure of 25.80. And off we go with our maths again. We times the 199 by that factor, and you get the 573717 that we see. So then the total cost for this future wheelchair up to age 63 is those two sums combined, which is £21,924.02.
Brilliant. And then we know that our OT report says that when Penny gets to age 63, it might be that she needs a different wheelchair. And I think that's what leads us to wheelchair 2, isn't it, Gemma? So if you could take us through the maths on that as well, please.
Yeah, that's right. So the rationale here is that by the time Penny reaches age of 63, she's going to be physically a little bit more frail, so her wheelchair needs are going to be a little bit more complex. It's going to be a more expensive wheelchair, an electric wheelchair, so the capital cost is going to increase to £7,500 per year. Now, we could go back and use table A5, but we're going to show off and we're going to do the longhand calculations, if you like. So the first point is to remind ourselves that life expectancy only runs to age 75. And what we're looking at is purchases from age 63 through to age 75. And so we need for this table 35. And we get to do some, now am I calling it interpolation or interpolation?
The right version, so interpolation.
Right, I shall interpolate for you. So we go to table 35, and of course, we've still got a discount rate of minus 0.25%. And we can read across for the 24 years and the 25 years values to reach our figure of 24.72, because that's how long it is until Penny is going to become 63. And this is our magic formula that, again, Dan talked us through very eloquently in Schedule 1, so I won't go through it all again. But the secret formula is, of course, x minus brackets, x minus y, times z, close brackets. And what we get when we do those figures, I'm not going to read them out because it is literally going to be math spread out, but you get a interpolated figure of 1.063844. You can see on the slide that we've got a rounded figure of 1.06, and we've got the 6 decimal place figures. Is it 6 or 5? Yeah, 6 decimal place figures. Different practitioners take a different view as to whether they round off their figures or not. It doesn't really matter which one you do, but just be consistent throughout the schedule. You'll see here, if you round the figures, you get a little bit less, to the tune of £28, but I think in the next calculation, the rounding gets a little bit more. So it all comes out in the wash. Choose one approach and stick to it. It's really a matter of preference. But what we've got here then is, this is our first purchase, what we've calculated. So when Penny is 63, she gets her first new type of wheelchair. The capital cost is £7,500. We've had to make a calculation to understand what the value of that will be for Penny today. And so we use table 35, which is discounting for that term certain up to, well, to age 63. But these wheelchairs are only going to last for 5 years. So then we're going to have to do a second calculation. So when Penny becomes 68, she'll need to buy her second of the more expensive wheelchairs, because again, our care expert has told us, or OT expert has told us, each of these chairs will also have a lifespan of 5 years. So what we're looking at here is working out the appropriate factor to apply so that we get the accurate capital cost that Penny will face when she's age 68. And the way we do that is we first of all look at how long away in the future is that. So to age 68 from a current age of 38.28 is a total of 29.72 years in the future. Then we pull out our table 35 and we interpolate between 29 years and 30 years, because we're trying to find the appropriate figure for 29.72 years. And what we get when we apply a magic formula, the appropriate factor for 29 is 1.053. For 30, it's 1.080. So we put all that into our formula, and the interpolated figure is 1.077244. And again, as I said before, we can either round that to 1.08 or we can keep with the 6 decimal places. But the capital cost of 7,500 times by our appropriate multiplier of 1.08 gives us 8,100. So that's the cost of buying the wheelchair when Penny is 68. That's the second type of wheelchair, and that's the replacement. We then have to do a third calculation because Penny's going to live to 75. So the wheelchair she buys when she's at 68 will wear out when Penny is 73. So we go through the same process again to look at to get the right value for £7,500 when Penny is 73 years old. And we do the 73 minus her current age of 38.28, which gives us 34.72 years. That's the figure that we then use with table 35. We go through the same interpolation process. So using table 35, the appropriate factor for 34 years is 1.0888. The appropriate factor for 35 years is 1.0916. Interpolating between the two, we get 1.090816, or rounded to 1.09. And when we use that with our multiplier of 7,500, we get this third capital sum, 8,175, or 818,112. And you might have noticed from the previous slides, sometimes our rounded figure is slightly higher, sometimes the rounded figure is slightly lower. As I said before, it broadly speaking, that all comes out in the wash. So what we've done 3 separate calculations for each of the 3 wheelchair purchases that Penny is going to have to do when she's 65, when she's 65, when she's 68, and when she's 73. That gives us our capital cost for the wheelchair, but that's not going to be the only expense that Penny is going to face with her wheelchair. And we're keeping it quite simple, and we're just going to put in an annual maintenance and charging costs, which I think in this case are £241.25 and £87 respectively, giving us an annual cost of £328.25. As I said, your care report will probably have lots of other types of costs involved, but we're keeping things fairly simple. What we then do is we can use table A6 in facts and figures, and that's a table that helps us with deferred losses over a period of time. So if you've got, for example, a period of loss that's going to run for 10 years, but that period won't start for 5 years, you can use table A6. It's in essence a combination of tables 35 and 36. And again, there's nothing wrong with doing it longhand, but table A6 is completely appropriate. So what we need to find here are the annual costs running from age 63 because that's when Penny gets this second new type of wheelchair, through to age 75, because that's when she's expected that her life will come to an end. So from 63 to 75, that's a 12-year period. That loss is going to commence in 25 years' time, because it's going to be 25 years, broadly speaking, until Penny is 63. So all we do is we take table A6 on page 42. We find on the years of loss row how many years of loss that we're looking at. As I've just said, that's 12. And then we look at how many years before the loss starts to run, which for us is 25. And you simply read down the column, read across, and the figure that we get is 12.97. So that's our multiplier for the annual cost of £328.25, which comes to £4,257.40. So you add those annual costs to the capital costs that we calculated previously, and then you get your grand total for this type of wheelchair. You add both of the wheelchair costs together. So the first type of wheelchair, the second type of wheelchair, the annualized costs for the maintenance and so forth, to get your grand total in your schedule for wheelchair costs.
Perfect, thank you. So there we've gone through both the facts and figures sneaky way that you can do it, and you can see how much quicker that can be, and also the longhand way if you are using table 35. As always, the best way to work through schedule school is to try doing it yourself at home with the resources. The next future loss that we're going to look at is the tilted armchair. And it may well not be the case, but let us assume for the purpose of this that Penny would have had an armchair anyway. Gemma, can you talk us through how you give credit for that?
Yeah, so there will be some items of aid or equipment that would have been required by an individual in any event. So, for example, a cooker. People have to buy cookers, but if you're injured, you may require a particular type of cooker with particular aids and adaptations, whether it's at low height or whatever. So what you have to do is give credit for the fact that you would have been incurring some expense in any event for the item. And we've got a very straightforward example here. Penny is going to require a tilting armchair when she's age 70, and we have to give some credit for the fact that she would have had to purchase an armchair in any event. And your expert may give you the cost of a standard armchair, or it may be that you or your solicitor do some research looking at online websites for furniture stores. That sort of thing is a perfectly acceptable way to get some evidence. And so for argument's sake, we're going to say that the cost of an armchair would be £500 for a perfectly standard non-aid or equipment adapted armchair. The capital cost of the particular tilting chair that Penny will require is £2,500. So we simply remove the cost that she would have faced, which is £500. So our recoverable capital cost is £2,000. And we can again use table A6, because this is going to be a deferred loss. It's not going to be something that Penny requires immediately. This is going to be purchased when she's 70 years old, which again, for argument's sake, is 32 years' time. So we simply read on table A6, our deferred period is 32 years, which gives us a factor of 1.083. We times that by our adjusted capital cost, and we get the recoverable capital cost of 2,166.
Perfect. And finally, we just want to look at a loss that occurs every year. And in the extract of the OT report that we have a transfer board. And I think in that OT report, that transfer board requires replacement every 5 years. But just for the purposes of this exercise, Gemma, can you talk us through briefly how to calculate a loss which occurs every year?
Yeah, so there's a number of different approaches to this. The one that I would normally use is to take table 36, which is multipliers for pecuniary loss for a term certain. So here we know that Penny's life expectancy is to age 75, which is a period of 36.72 years. And so what we're looking to do is to find the appropriate multiplier. We turn to table 36 and we interpolate between 36 years and 37 years, because what we're looking for is 36.72 years. And again, applying the formula that we're now well used to dealing with, the appropriate multiplier becomes 38.46. We times our multiplier by our multiplicand, 38.46 by £71.60, and we get our total loss of £2,753.88. Now, we could do a cheapskate shortcut way and looking at table A5 as a shorter-hand way of doing it. And if you look at table A5, we get for a frequency of loss of 1 year over a period of 37 years, because I've rounded up because we're at 36.72, that table gives us a multiplier of 38.82. So they're not that far apart, but as I say, the appropriate way is really to do the longhand at table 36.
Brilliant, thank you. That's all the maths. And if you are wanting to go back over interpolation or see the debate about how it should be pronounced, we do go through that all again in seminar 1.
So I feel it wouldn't be right to do an aids and equipment seminar without touching briefly on exoskeletons. So the word exoskeleton comes from the name of the rigid external skin of invertebrate animals such as bugs, spiders, crabs, etc. And the exoskeleton allows their body to keep its form without an internal skeleton. So in robotics then, exoskeletons are essentially robotic suits, and they attach to the outside of the claimant's body like a skin, and they provide extra power to the normal movement of the muscles. The people who are currently benefiting most from the technology are those who have suffered from a spinal cord injury, a stroke, or a head injury, such as a traumatic brain injury. Those supported and working with exoskeleton users believe that the impact of the suits is remarkable and extensive, and they really are. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend going and looking at some videos of exoskeletons in use. As an emerging technology with a variety of applications from medical rehabilitation to use in industrial manufacturing, exoskeletons have received significant investment in recent years. However, despite this investment, the potential of exo, it's not fully yet appreciated. So there are a couple different types of exoskeletons. There are upper body exoskeletons, providing support to the upper body, including arms, shoulders, torso. A recent example of those is the Otterbuck exo, and that's how you say it. We also have lower body exoskeletons, which are providing support to legs, hips, and lower torso. A good example of that is the rehabilitation system of the ReWalk. There are also full body exoskeletons as well, which provide support to the whole body, and thus are the most powerful exoskeletons. A recent example of that is the Guardian XO. And it's important to note that when we're speaking about exoskeletons, we must include its replacements and associated costs, and they can be very costly. Ben Rogers of Stewart's was one of the first UK lawyers to secure landmark awards for compensation for the purchase and replacement of the Rex and exoskeletons for his clients. An exoskeleton is not an easy piece of aids and equipment to recover. Indeed, they can cost £50,000 to £80,000, if not more. And then you have the associated costs and replacement over the lifetime, which is where you really start racking up some of the costs there. A 100% award could easily exceed £500,000 for the lifetime costs.
And as you've said, Demi, exoskeletons are not easily recoverable items. They can have a number of benefits, both physical and psychological, including mobility improvement, progress in bladder and bowel function, and a reduction in pain. And if one was to take the simple approach to tort, you would say, well, the claimant's entitled to be put back in the position that she would have been in had the accident not occurred. And put bluntly, exoskeletons have the ability to allow those who are wheelchair users to walk as they had before, to the extent they can. But putting it like that is oversimplifying it. Gemma, do you want to talk us through some of the arguments that may be raised in dispute of exoskeletons, and consider how a claimant may want to be in the best position to put an exoskeleton in their schedule?
Yeah, as I think Demi rightly says, this is an emerging technology and it's not going to be right for everybody. They are, as I understand it, difficult to maintain, fairly difficult to use, and they are very expensive. And they are not a perfect replica for being able to stand up and walk down the street. What they do provide is a degree of normality and a degree of freedom for the individual users. So if you have a claimant who is likely to be particularly benefited by an exoskeleton, somebody who's got the appropriate space in their accommodation, who has demonstrated a willingness and an ability to use an exoskeleton, then you're more likely to recover the costs. And this is the same as we talked about at the start of this seminar. The best way to recover the cost of aid and equipment is to have the claimant use them so that they can give evidence at trial to say, I've used it regularly, I find it beneficial for X, Y, and Z reasons. It's very difficult for a defendant to say that a cost is disproportionate or is unnecessary and unreasonable if a claimant can show that they're regularly using the equipment and the device. I think with exoskeletons, some claimants may benefit from using them periodically. So the costs of having their own equipment, their own set of equipment, wouldn't be justified, but the cost of going to a specialist centre, say once a fortnight, to use the equipment or the exoskeleton for, say, 2 hours at a time, that might be the reasonable approach for them to take, because actually that fulfills the general needs and advantages of using an exoskeleton without having the very substantial costs, which may be argued aren't going to be necessarily proportionate. Some people find that actually they've got complete independence or near complete independence in a wheelchair, they're maneuverable, they're easy to use, they're reliable, and they are perfectly happy using that rather than going into an exoskeleton. So it's very much going to be subjective to the individual claimant that you're dealing with.
Perfect. And that takes us full circle somewhat, because where we started with at the beginning was dealing with how you recover aids and equipment and the approach that the court may take. So that's everything. Thank you very much to Demi and to Gemma. I still feel a little bit nervous when I do advocacy in front of my pupil supervisor. So if I'm talking fast during that, this is why. If you do have any questions at all, we're all actually on Twitter. So feel free to send us a direct message and we will help you with any questions you may have at the beginning of the next seminar. The next seminar is going to look at accommodation claims, and I'm going to be joined by Sarah Crowther QC in going through that. But for now, that's everything. So thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you.